History has a way of hiding its darkest moments, especially when the victims are the most vulnerable, those with no weapons, no political power, and no protection. We often hear about the grand battles, the rise and fall of empires, and the powerful men who shaped the world. But what about the stories that were never meant to be told? The ones buried in forgotten diaries, whispered in hushed tones, and carried in the memories of those who suffered in silence. Today, we're going to uncover one such story, a chapter of history that is as heartbreaking as it is shocking. It has the story of Christian nuns who lived in isolated convents during the height of the Ottoman Empire. These women had dedicated their lives to a higher purpose. They took vows of purity, peace, and service to God. They chose a life of quiet contemplation, prayer, and charity, separated from the secular world. Their convents, often nestled in remote, mountainous regions, were meant to be sanctuary places of spiritual refuge and tranquility. They expected their days to be filled with silent prayer, tending to the sick, and the simple rhythms of community life. They sought peace, but what came from many was a storm of fear, cruelty, and humiliation. To understand their plight, we need to step back into the world of the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, this vast and powerful empire stretched across 3 continents, a melting pot of cultures, religions, and ethnicities. Under the millet system, non-Muslim communities, including Christians and Jews, were allowed to govern themselves according to their own laws and traditions. On paper, they were protected subjects, or dhimmis. They paid a special tax, the jizya, in exchange for military exemption and the right to practice their faith. However, the reality on the ground was often far more complex and harsh than the official policy suggested. While the sultans in Constantinople issued decrees of protection, life in the far-flung provinces could be drastically different. Local governors, military commanders, and roving bands of soldiers often operated with a great deal of autonomy. For these men, the isolated Christian communities were easy targets. Des convents, in particular with their reputation for housing defenseless women and, supposedly, hidden treasures, were like magnets for those with malicious intent. The nuns' vows of non-violence and their commitment to a life of seclusion made them especially vulnerable. They had no weapons to defend themselves, no men to protect them, and often no recourse to justice. Their monasteries were frequently located in remote areas, far from any centralized authority that might offer aid. This isolation, which they had chosen for spiritual reasons, became their greatest liability. When danger arrived at their gates, they were utterly alone. Raids on these convents were brutal and systematic. They weren't just random acts of violence. They were calculated attacks designed to terrorize, subjugate, and extract wealth. Soldiers would storm the convent walls, breaking down doors and shattering the sacred silence. Their first target was often the church. They would desecrate the holy altars, steal precious chalices, icons, and liturgical garments, items that held immense spiritual value for the community. This wasn't just robbery. It was a profound act of psychological warfare, aimed at breaking the spirit of the nuns and demonstrating the dominance of the invaders. After looting the church, the soldiers would turn their attention to the nuns themselves. These women, who had sworn a life of chastity and purity, were subjected to unspeakable horrors. They were dragged from their cells, their religious habits torn from their bodies. The sanctity of their vows was violated in the most brutal way imaginable. Many were subjected to repeated assaults, a trauma that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But the cruelty didn't end there. Humiliation was a key weapon. Nuns were forced to perform degrading acts, to serve their attackers, and to watch as their sacred home was turned into a barracks. They were stripped of their dignity, their identity as consecrated women shattered. For them, this was more than just physical pain. It was a spiritual annihilation. In their own words, many later described this experience as a suffering worse than death. The physical wounds might heal, but the spiritual and psychological scars were permanent. They had given their lives to God, only to have their bodies and souls violated by men. The survivors of these attacks faced an impossible future. Many were left with nothing. Their homes were destroyed, their communities scattered. Some tried to rebuild, to piece together the fragments of their former lives, but the fear never truly left them. How could they feel safe in a place that had been so violently Others were forced to abandon their vows and their convents altogether, fleeing to seek refuge in more populated Christian villages or towns, their spiritual calling cut short by trauma. And what about justice? In most cases, there was none. Complaining to the local Ottoman authorities was often futile, and sometimes even dangerous. The officials themselves might be complicit in the raids, or simply indifferent to the suffering of a small community of Christian women. The nuns' voices were silenced, their stories buried. Their pain was a footnote in the grand narrative of empire, a detail too insignificant to be recorded by the official chroniclers of the time. This is why these stories are so important. They force us to look beyond the history of kings and battles and see the human cost of conflict and power. They remind us that behind the grand sweep of historical events are individual lives, filled with hope, faith, and terrible suffering. The story of these nuns is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but it is also a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist when the powerful prey on the vulnerable. Their experiences were not recorded in the grand histories written by the victors. Instead, we find them in fragmented accounts in the margins of monastery records, in letters exchanged between church leaders, and in the oral traditions passed down through generations. These sources paint a harrowing picture of what it meant to be a Christian woman in a convent on the fringes of the Ottoman Empire. It was a life lived on a knife's edge, where the sacred and the profane, faith and fear, were in constant, violent collision. By bringing these stories into the light, we are not just correcting the historical record, we are giving a voice back to those who were silenced. We are honoring their memory and acknowledging their suffering. It's a difficult and painful history to confront, but it's essential. Because if we ignore the darkest parts of our past, we risk forgetting the lessons they have to teach us about justice, compassion, and the enduring need to protect the most vulnerable among us. The fate of these women is a somber chapter, a stark reminder that faith and devotion offer no shield against human cruelty. Have you ever wondered what life was really like behind the stone walls of a convent? It wasn't just about prayer and silent contemplation. For many, it was a world of routine, hard work, and a profound, quiet strength that is often overlooked in our history books. Let's take a closer look at the hidden lives of the women who called these places home. Imagine waking up before the sun even touches the horizon. The air is cool and still, and the first sound you hear is the gentle ringing of a bell, calling you to morning prayer. This was the start of every single day. The chapel, lit by flickering candlelight, would fill with the soft murmur of voices reciting ancient prayers. This shared moment of devotion wasn't just a ritual. It was the spiritual anchor for the entire community, a time to find focus and peace before the day's work began. After prayer, the convent would come alive with quiet industry. There was bread to be baked, the aroma filling the stone corridors. The dough was kneaded by hand, a rhythmic and almost meditative task that provided sustenance for everyone within the walls. This simple act of making bread was a cornerstone of their self-sufficient lifestyle. They weren't just praying, they were providing for themselves, day in and day out. Beyond the kitchen, other tasks awaited. The chapel, the heart of the convent, needed constant care. Polishing the wooden pews until they shone, sweeping the cold stone floors, and arranging fresh flowers on the altar were all tasks done with a sense of reverence. It wasn't just cleaning, it was an act of service, a way of showing respect for their sacred space. Every corner was tended to with meticulous care. And then there were the gardens, tucked away within the convent walls. These weren't just decorative flower beds, they were essential kitchen gardens and medicinal herb plots. The nuns would spend hours tending to the soil, planting seeds, weeding, and watering. They grew their own vegetables and herbs, not only for their meals, but also for creating remedies. These women were skilled herbalists, passing down knowledge of natural healing from one generation to the next. The garden was their pharmacy, their grocery store, and a place of quiet connection with the earth. Now, who were these women? The image of an elderly, solemn nun is a common stereotype, but the reality was far more diverse. Many were incredibly young, some barely teenagers. For some, entering the convent was a genuine calling, a deep spiritual choice they made for themselves. For others, however, the choice wasn't entirely their own. In an era where a woman's options were limited, a family might place a daughter in a convent for various reasons. Perhaps they couldn't afford a dowry, or maybe it was a way to secure a respectable future for her. Then there were the older women, perhaps widows or those who had lived a full life in the outside world and were now seeking refuge and peace. They brought with them a lifetime of experience, adding a different kind of wisdom to the community. So, you had this incredible mix of ages and backgrounds, all living together under one roof. The young learned from the old, and the old found purpose in guiding the young. It was a unique, multi-generational family, bound not by blood, but by shared faith and routine. Life inside these walls was predictable, and that predictability was a source of great comfort. In a world that was often chaotic and dangerous, the convent offered a sanctuary. There were no luxuries here. The beds were simple, the food was plain, and personal possessions were few. But what they lacked in material wealth, they gained in security. The thick stone walls didn't just keep the world out. They created a space where women could live without the constant pressures and dangers faced by their counterparts on the outside. Their most valuable possessions weren't gold or jewels, but their spiritual vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. These vows were the bedrock of their existence. They structured their relationships with each other and with God. These principles guided every decision and every action, creating a community built on mutual trust and a shared higher purpose. Their world was protected by these vows, by the rhythm of their daily routines, and by the unshakable strength of their collective faith. But this peaceful isolation, this deliberate separation from the world, also created a profound vulnerability. Think about it. A community composed almost entirely of women, with no soldiers, no weapons, and very few powerful connections to the political figures of the day. Their strength was spiritual, not military. They were self-contained, and their focus was inward, on their community and their relationship with God. This made them an easy target. When political tensions flared, when kingdoms went to war, or when new ideologies swept across the land, these quiet, unassuming convents were often caught in the crossfire. Rulers looking to seize assets saw convents not as sacred places, but as properties filled with land and resources, ripe for the taking. During periods of religious reformation, convents were often seen as symbols of the old order, and were among the first institutions to be dissolved, their inhabitants scattered and their way of life destroyed overnight. Imagine the terror of that. The walls that once provided safety suddenly became a trap. The routine that provided comfort was shattered. These women, who had dedicated their lives to peace and prayer, were suddenly faced with violence, uncertainty, and the loss of their home and everything they had ever known. Their story is a powerful reminder that peace and security can be incredibly fragile. The history of convents is a tale of quiet resilience. It's about the strength found in community, the dignity of labor, and the courage to maintain faith. In a world that was often hostile, these weren't passive women waiting for salvation. They were active participants in their own lives, creating a world for themselves that was meaningful and purpose-driven. They were scholars, artists, healers, and leaders in their own right, all within the confines of their cloistered world. So, the next time you see the image of a nun or a convent, I hope you'll think beyond the stereotypes. Remember the young girls and older women, the early morning prayers, the smell of baking bread, and the gardens teeming with life. Remember the peace they cultivated and the vulnerability they faced. Theirs is a story of quiet strength that deserves to be heard and remembered. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this glimpse into the hidden world of convents interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the forgotten corners of history. See you next time. When we think of the Ottoman Empire, we often picture vast territories, powerful sultans, and incredible architecture. But for the millions of people living within its borders, life was a complex tapestry of cultures, religions, and constant change. For centuries, the empire was a formidable power, but its history is also marked by internal strife, shifting borders, and brutal conflicts. And caught in the crossfire were countless communities, particularly the Christian populations scattered across the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Middle East. Today, we're going to delve into a story that is often overlooked in the grand narratives of empires, the story of Christian convents and the nuns who lived within their walls. These weren't just quiet places of prayer. They were powerful symbols in a world where religious identity could mean the difference between life and death. Imagine a map of the Ottoman Empire, not as a solid block of color, but as a dynamic, breathing entity. Borders were constantly being redrawn. Wars with neighboring powers like the Habsburgs or the Russian Empire were a frequent reality. And within the empire itself, rebellions and uprisings were a constant threat to stability. In this turbulent environment, Christian communities had to navigate a delicate existence. They were subjects of the Sultan, yet they held on to their distinct faith and traditions. At the heart of many of these communities stood the convents. To the local Christians, these institutions were more than just religious buildings. They were a visible and enduring symbol of their presence, a testament to a faith that had existed in these lands for centuries before the arrival of the Ottomans. They were centers of literacy, charity, and social cohesion. In a world that was often hostile, the convent walls offered a semblance of sanctuary, but this very significance made them a target. From the perspective of some Ottoman authorities, these convents weren't just peaceful religious houses. They were viewed with deep suspicion. Were they safe havens for rebels plotting against the Sultan? Were they hiding spots for messengers carrying coded letters between insurgent groups? Were they secret centers of resistance, fanning the flames of Christian identity and encouraging dissent? In an empire constantly worried about internal fractures, this suspicion could quickly curdle into paranoia and violence. Furthermore, convents were often seen as easy, unprotected targets. Unlike fortified towns or military outposts, they were typically defended only by their stone walls and the faith of their inhabitants. This vulnerability made them a tempting prize for marauding bands of soldiers, irregulars, or local militias looking for plunder or an easy way to assert dominance. When tensions flared, the Ottoman military or local authorities would often dispatch troops to inspect, control, or punish Christian areas suspected of disloyalty. These actions were rarely surgical. More often than not, they were brutal campaigns of collective punishment designed to terrorize the entire population into submission. And in these moments of extreme violence, nuns often faced the most horrific treatment. Why? It wasn't because they posed a direct military threat. A community of women dedicated to a life of prayer was hardly a match for armed soldiers. The reason was far more cynical and cruel. The cruelty was a form of psychological warfare. In many traditional societies, both Christian and Muslim, women, especially religious women, were held in a position of special honor. They represented the purity and moral core of the community. To attack a nun was not just an attack on an individual. It was a profound violation of the community's most sacred values. It was a deliberate act of humiliation, designed to send a clear and devastating message. We can touch your most sacred symbols. We can defile what you hold most dear. Nothing is safe from us. Humiliating the nuns was a way to break the morale of the entire community. It was a tactic to shatter their spirit, to instill a deep sense of helplessness and despair. If even the most revered and protected women were not safe, then who was? The stories of these attacks would spread like wildfire, sowing fear and demonstrating the absolute power of the aggressors. The physical violence was just one part of the assault. The psychological wound it inflicted was often deeper and longer lasting. Let's look at some historical contexts. During the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s, for example, numerous monasteries and convents became battlegrounds. On islands like Chios and Sara, Ottoman forces carried out massacres where convents were specifically targeted. Eyewitness accounts from the period describe scenes of unimaginable horror, where nuns were brutalized, not just as part of the general chaos of war, but in a systematic effort to demoralize the Greek rebels. Similarly, during the Bulgarian April Uprising of 1876, Ottoman irregular troops, known as Bashibazauks, were infamous for their cruelty. Reports from journalists and diplomats at the time documented the destruction of villages, churches, and monasteries. Convents in places like Baitok became symbols of the atrocities, where the nuns inside suffered fates that were used to illustrate the barbarity of the response and galvanize international opinion against the Ottoman Empire. These weren't isolated incidents. Similar patterns can be found during the Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek genocides in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Convents were looted, burned, and their inhabitants subjected to the worst forms of violence. The goal was consistent: to erase the Christian presence, not just by destroying buildings and people, but by attacking the very soul of the community. The attackers knew that the desecration of a convent and the violation of its nuns would be a memory that would haunt the survivors for generations, a scar on their collective identity. It's important to understand that this wasn't random, mindless violence. It was a calculated weapon. By targeting the most vulnerable and symbolically important members of a community, the perpetrators aimed to achieve a complete psychological victory. They wanted to prove that resistance was futile and that the Christian identity itself was a liability. The message was that there was no sacred space, no refuge from their power. This strategy of using gendered violence as a tool of war is, tragically, not unique to the Ottoman Empire. We've seen it throughout history and across the globe. But understanding its application in this specific context helps us see the Ottoman Empire not as a monolith, but as a complex and often brutal place, especially for its minority populations during times of conflict. The story of these convents is a somber reminder of the human cost of empire and war. It shows how buildings of peace can be turned into theaters of conflict, and how the most devout individuals can become pawns in a larger political struggle. The resilience of these communities in the face of such horror is a testament to the strength of their faith and culture. Many of these convents were eventually rebuilt, and the memories of the martyrs were preserved, becoming a central part of their religious and national identity. By remembering these forgotten victims, we gain a more complete and honest understanding of the past. Their suffering was not just a footnote in history. It was a central part of the story of the decline of a once mighty empire and the painful birth of the modern nations that emerged from its ashes. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a difficult but important topic. If you found this video insightful, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more explorations of the hidden corners of history. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. See you next time.